Hey everybody, I'm standing here in Duvall's Tavern, historic Alexandria, Virginia. This is one of the most noteworthy historic spots that we have, not just in Alexandria, but I would argue in Virginia, if not on the East Coast itself. And I'm going to tell you exactly why. First of all, the name Duvall's Tavern goes back to the original tavern owner, William Duvall. The building itself was built in 1783. That's an important year. That is the year that the Revolutionary War comes to an end. Some things that happened in 1783, specifically in terms of General George Washington. December 4th, 1783, shortly after the British left New York City, George Washington is in a tavern in New York City called Fraunces Tavern. He's there to give his farewell to his officers. He then comes south to where Congress was meeting in Annapolis, Maryland. On December 23rd, 1783, George Washington was in Annapolis for the very famous resignation of his commission. He's doing something very important. He's establishing the firm tradition of civilian control over the military. He is giving power back to Congress, relinquishing control of the army, doing something, if you think about, in history, a lot of generals have tried to hold on to power. Napoleon is someone that comes to mind. You think about people that lead revolutions. Frequently, they have a lot of political capital. George Washington certainly had that in spades. After he resigns his commission, his goal is to get back to Mount Vernon. He is at Mount Vernon appropriately for this time of year. We're here in December. He is back at Mount Vernon by Christmas of 1783. And where is he on New Year's Eve? Well, that's 6 days later. He is right here in Alexandria, celebrating right here where I am standing, Duvall's Tavern, New Year's Eve, December 31st of 1783. Think about it. It's one of his first public appearances now that he is no longer in uniform. He is a civilian again. He's exchanged the sword for the plowshare, and he is standing right in the spot that I'm standing in. Now, what's really interesting is that if you want to, you can come here and stand in this spot. You can actually eat in this spot. You can actually sleep in the same location where I am standing. This is one of Alexandria's most historic Airbnb properties. So you can actually rent the spot that George Washington celebrated December 31st, 1783. Very specific terminology. He was feted here. He was honored here. That comes from an old French word. It's a derivation of feast. If you think about Washington, he's celebrating with a lot of his friends, neighbors, people that were very close to him. Many of them were Revolutionary War veterans, so many of them had served with him throughout a period of time during the 8.5 years in which George Washington was Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Today, if you were to come here and rent out the space, it's about 40 people that can actually be here. We're on the second floor. We're in the ballroom, so we're in the actual public gathering space where toasts would have been done to George Washington. You can't rent Fraunces Tavern in New York City. It is an actual museum and it's a working restaurant, but you can rent Duvall's Tavern right here in historic Old Town Alexandria. Okay, so we're still here in Duvall's Tavern. However, there's a really neat piece of history that ties to Duvall's specifically in the 20th century. Now, this is very significant. For 35 years, this was actually a property that was owned by a woman named Frankie Welch, who had her business here. And what was her business? She designed clothing, specifically dresses, as well as some of these scarves that you see right here. In fact, the property still has scarves that they show from Frankie Welch. Now, you may not be familiar with the name Frankie Welch. I'll confess that before coming to Alexandria, I didn't know much about her. But if you've ever been to the Smithsonian Museum of American History, and you've gone through the section that has a lot of recent political history, you may see a very nice dress, specifically the dress that Betty Ford wore to the inauguration of her husband, President Gerald Ford. That dress was designed right here by Frankie Welch in Alexandria. Frankie Welch didn't just design Betty Ford's dress. but she considered Betty Ford a very good friend. They were very close with one another. So Frankie Welch was designing this dress specifically for her friend. Now, Frankie Welch designed clothing for not just Betty Ford, but 6 other First Ladies of the United States. So 7 First Ladies of the United States, Frankie Welch considered or had on her client list, which is really, really quite something. And again, this is another part of Alexandria's history that is so great. And not only do we have this colonial period, this Revolutionary War period history here, but we also have this significant history in the 20th century. You really get a good blend of old and new. Presidential history going back to George Washington, and then coming all the way up into the 1900s, specifically with the connections to presidents like Gerald Ford. That's another thing that makes Alexandria so remarkable. Frankie Welch passed away a few years ago. She was in her 90s when she did. But again, she was here for 35 years, from 1963 until 1998 in the heart of Alexandria. We're only 1 block from the visitor center. We're right across the street from Alexandria City Hall and Market Square. So we are truly in the heart of the old and historic district here at the property on Cameron Street. Say another aspect of Duvall's Tavern that I have to tell you about, and I keep referring to it as Duvall's Tavern. Like a lot of things historically, we give them one name so you can just reference it. But I could also just as well call this the former home of Charles Lee, not to be confused with General Charles Lee, who George Washington fired at the Battle of Monmouth, the summer of 1778. No, I'm referring to Charles Lee, who is George Washington's personal attorney. He was actually collector of the customs when he was living here, collector of customs for the Port of Alexandria. He was at this location, this home rather, from 1789 until 1793. He becomes George Washington's 3rd Attorney General during Washington's 2nd term as president. Now, Washington leaves office in March of 1797. After that, John Adams becomes the 2nd president of the United States. What did Charles Lee do? Well, he continued to serve as Attorney General throughout the duration of John Adams' presidency. So Charles Lee was both Attorney General of the United States during Washington's 2nd term and during John Adams' 1st and only term as President of the United States. Now, what happened with the 3rd president, with Thomas Jefferson? Well, Jefferson and Lee were very different in terms of their politics. Lee, like Washington and Adams, was very much Federalist. Jefferson was what we would call a Democrat-Republican, or just Jefferson's Republicans at the time. So you have these 2 emerging political sides. You have these 2 political parties that really have sharp division in the 1790s specifically. And so what happens? Well, Charles Lee will be involved in one of the most significant Supreme Court cases in the United States. In fact, after Jefferson assumes office, or at the time when Jefferson was about to assume office, John Adams made a number of appointments, specifically appointments to be Justice of the Peace. These are known as John Adams's midnight appointments. What happened next becomes a matter of controversy. You see, these appointments make it to the desk of Secretary of State James Madison, who decides to ignore the appointments that came at the last minute. This turns into a political controversy that ultimately spawns the Supreme Court case we know as Marbury versus Madison. The lead plaintiff in the case was William Marbury, who was from Georgetown. In fact, you can still see William Marbury's house on M Street in Georgetown. If you're wondering what the house is used for in Georgetown, well, that is actually the Ukraine embassy. 3 other plaintiffs, though, were from Alexandria, including William Ramsey, Captain John Harper's son, William Harper, and a very prominent merchant in this town, a man named Robert T. Huey. So of the 4 plaintiffs, 3 were actually from Alexandria, which is really good. We have a very strong connection to that landmark Supreme Court case. And who was the lawyer representing these plaintiffs? Well, it was none other than Charles Lee. And Charles Lee was representing these plaintiffs in the case. This case for the plaintiffs sadly didn't go as they would have liked, but what's more important is the ruling of Chief Justice John Marshall, which established the Supreme Court as the de facto third branch of government. It gave the Supreme Court power to adjudicate all laws, all cases that came from lower courts, that came from state courts, to determine the constitutionality of those cases. So think about this. Prior to that time, there was actually the Supreme Court for a little over 10 years, a little over a decade at that time, wasn't actually reviewing cases from lower courts or from Congress to determine if that was constitutional. It's something that we take for granted that the Supreme Court does to this day. Well, it wasn't until over a decade into the period of the United States and even into the third presidential term of Thomas Jefferson that case was actually decided in Marbury versus Madison. And again, Charles Lee was part of this case as far as being the attorney representing the lead plaintiffs. Another thing I'll mention about Charles Lee, he was related to the very prominent Lee family of Virginia. He is one branch of the family. He is a part of the family that is much more Federalist in terms of their political persuasion. He was related to, in terms of being brothers, with Henry Lee, Henry Light Horse Harry Lee, who was George Washington's favorite, in my opinion, one of his favorite cavalry officers. Probably favorite, along with George Washington's second cousin, who was Colonel William Washington, who was also a very gifted cavalry officer. But Henry Lee and Charles Lee were brothers. Henry Lee was the father of who would become a future Confederate general, Robert E. Lee, which means that Charles Lee was Robert E. Lee's uncle. Okay, still standing here in Duvall's Tavern in historic Alexandria, Virginia. Now, Duvall's Tavern was a tavern for several years in the 1780s, then becomes a residence of a man named Daniel Roberdeau while he was building his house on South Lee Street, at the time Water Street in Alexandria, and then it becomes the residence of Charles Lee. But in 1793, this location actually becomes a commercial property. In fact, it becomes the first location of the Bank of Alexandria. What's very significant about the Bank of Alexandria is this is the first chartered bank in Virginia. It was chartered by the Virginia General Assembly in 1792. What's going on at this period of time? Well, the Bank of the United States has been created, and there's actually a number of branch banks that are being established throughout the United States. However, there's not a branch bank in Virginia. So the Virginia General Assembly does not want to be left behind. Virginia is a very large, very important state economically, so they do draft a charter for the Bank of Alexandria. The Bank of Alexandria would operate here from 1793 until 1807. It would actually move across the street in 1807. We still have some pictures of the bank vault that was here. That vault would be moved across the street. The bank would operate at its second location from 1807 to 1834. It would go out of business, specifically during the Andrew Jackson presidency. There was a lot of turmoil in the economy, specifically in the banking sector. Andrew Jackson was planning to not renew the national bank charter. This did cause a run on a number of local banks, including the Bank of Alexandria. But very specific, I want to bring it back to the 1790s for a moment and just mention that here in Alexandria, where the bank was operating, it did count one of its largest customers as George Washington. In fact, at the end of George Washington's life, he ended up getting a loan, or what was called then a discount, from the Bank of Alexandria, specifically to build a townhouse on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. This is really important history. I want to stress something important with this, is that D.C. Was not quite D.C. yet in terms of being the capital of the United States. The capital was still in Philadelphia in 1799, but it was moving to D.C. in 1800. And if you think about the location of the U.S. Capitol today, we think of all these big monuments, all the big Capitol building itself, the rotunda, but there's nothing there at this time. In fact, it's very much still country land. It's still very swampy, sparsely populated. So George Washington decides to take some initiative. He's always a lead from the front type of guy. And in 1799, he actually develops on his lot that he had purchased on Capitol Hill in D.C., he develops 2 adjoining townhouses, has those built. And he gets a loan from the Bank of Alexandria specifically to pay for the construction of his townhomes. So it's a really good example of how George Washington is leaning on the Bank of Alexandria, this very prominent Alexandria institution, to do something both for himself personally, but also that has this service component to it by trying to develop our nation's capital. Now, I will finish up by mentioning George Washington was not just a customer in the Bank of Alexandria, he was a shareholder in the Bank of Alexandria. In fact, he bought shares of stock in the Bank of Alexandria during his presidency. Really interesting. He has a letter, or a number of letters, going back and forth between him and his secretary, a man named Tobias Lear, in which he's directing Lear to acquire shares in the Bank of Alexandria. Those shares at the time did pay a dividend. In fact, the dividend on an annual basis was about 9 to 10% in terms of the annual yield that you would get from your dividend. Washington thought that was a pretty good deal. He acquired 20 shares of stock in the Bank of Alexandria. $200 was the par value, so $4,000 worth of shares. And when he died in 1799, in his will, he directed those shares to be left to the Alexandria Academy. What an amazing story of Washington relying on one Alexandria institution to then support, after he died, another Alexandria institution that he himself had been involved in creating. Folks, if you like this history, you gotta come here to Alexandria. We have so many of these stories. You can take a tour with us. You can stay here. This is actually an Airbnb. You could stay at Duvall's Tavern. You can also get my book, George Washington and Alexandria, A Founding Friendship. I do highlight a lot of the stories that I'm telling you about right now. So we got a lot of opportunities for you to immerse yourself in this incredible history. You gotta think about Alexandria when you're thinking about the history of George Washington, the United States, and so much that took place in our great nation's history.